Welcome back for more physiology. Today we're going to talk about brain function. In particular, we're going to try and figure out the functions of the brain. So when we look at the brain, it's a collection of neurons with some support cells. And one of the things that's hard to remember is that each neuron has about 200 other neurons that connect to it, that synapse with it, which means that that neuron is probably going to come in contact with potentially 200 separate neurons. So what we end up having is this massive network of cells touching other cells and interacting. And we have unfathomable numbers of interactions that are going on. So with each neuron behaving something slightly differently, what we end up getting is this massive integration project that can result in consciousness and all the processing that our brain is capable of doing, and all the parts that it's not capable of doing too. So when I look at this brain, I know we've already dealt with how it actually all comes about, but if we continue that concept of the tube starts off with three segments. We have the hindbrain called the rhombencephalon, the midbrain called the mesencephalon, and the forebrain called the prosencephalon. The hindbrain and the forebrain are going to split up into segments, and those segments end up being called the myelencephalon and the metencephalon in the hindbrain. So myelencephalon being the spinal or the medulla, the metencephalon being the pons and the cerebellum. Mesencephalon, mesen means middle, cephalon means brain or skull. So it turns out to be your midbrain. The prosencephalon will split apart into the telencephalon, the far away part, and the diencephalon, the second part. The diencephalon we just call the diencephalon, and the telencephalon we call the cerebrum. In order to keep that tube there, the tube is just a conduit in order for us to flow liquid around. The name of that liquid is called CSF. It's actually formed within, if you look at this picture, in the middle we happen to have those little hooks on the sides. That's going to be the lateral ventricles. We have this part in the middle, that's going to be the third ventricle, and down here at the bottom, which is the fourth ventricle. At those ventricles, there are a series of glial cells called the choroid plexi. What they end up doing is they produce CSF. The CSF flows in these ventricles, pours out the ventricles from lateral to the third to the fourth, out down that central canal of the spinal cord. At the bottom of your spinal cord, around L2, L3, it will pour out, and it flows its way back on up along the outside of the spinal cord, along the outside of the brain, where it's recollected into a blood vessel that you memorized once upon a time ago called the dural sinus, where it then gets redeposited into your circulation. We trap all of that liquid inside using a layer of membranes that we call the meninges. There turn out to be three of them. There's a layer that would be just next to the spinal cord and brain that we call the pia mater, or the intimate layer. We have a little sticky layer that's where the liquid flows, called the arachnoid, because it looks like a spider web. Then we have a really hard, durable surface on the outside that we call the dura mater, or the hard layer, or the tough layer. That allows this liquid to flow around, and we can actually diagnose things going wrong with your brain or spinal cord by looking at the liquid, much like how we can diagnose parts of your body going wrong by looking at your blood. So if we look at the brain proper, what are the parts? So if we start at the bottom, so we're starting with the base of the brain that we can collectively call the brainstem. Brainstem is composed of the medulla, the cerebellum, and the pons, and the midbrain. If I focus in just on the medulla, its job are basic functions, meaning let's keep you alive. Your respiratory center is there, your cardiac center is there, your ability to regulate what your osmolarity turns out to be is there. Basic things that prevent you from dying we find in the medulla. If I look at the pons and the cerebellum, the next section, what I happen to notice is the cerebellum is actually heavily folded up, and that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of functioning going on there. If I were to take a dissection of it, what I actually find are groupings of nuclei. These nuclei are just collections of cell bodies, and they actually form tracks, meaning we can connect parts of the cerebellum to different parts of your body along your spinal cord. What that turns out to do is it is the coordination of muscular movement. The job of your cerebellum is to control muscular movement. The way the two sides, the right and the left of your cerebellum, speak to each other is actually by using your pons. The pons is just the connection between the two halves. That's all it turns out to be. Because when you look at this, you can kind of almost argue that, oh, well, right there would be the brainstem-ish area. This area back here is the cerebellum. This area right up here in the front, that would be the pons. Next segment would turn out to be the midbrain. Midbrain has a whole bunch of functions that, for the most part, we don't talk about too much. The medulla, keep you alive. Cerebellum and the pons, let's let you move. The midbrain is when we really start to deal with information and its processing of information and figuring out what needs to go where. So we have collectively these things called the colliculi, the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. There's two above and there's two below. What they turn out to do is they're relay centers, meaning information flows in and then they determine where that information needs to flow next. You also have other things like the pineal gland, which is actually something that secretes a chemical called melatonin, which regulates are you awake or are you asleep. It's your third eye. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that, again, just deals with sending information out. We're connecting the higher functions of the upper brain and the basic let's not die functions of the lower brain. If I take out, meaning if part of your brain were to die, meaning midbrain, cerebellum, pons, and medulla die, you are brain dead, and the result of that is without machine assistance, you do not survive. You must have these things to survive. The other parts, so the diencephalon and the cerebrum, are there to give you human-esque qualities, but they're not essential to staying alive. The diencephalon is actually a very strange region. During the brain dissection, I asked you to look for a little circle, and that circular area was the thalamus. And surrounding that thalamus, there's a whole bunch of dents, or at least if you dissected it perfectly, you would have seen it. What you actually have with that is you have, use the microphone. So this here would be the thalamus. And surrounding the thalamus, if I do one half of it, you would have a gap between my hand and the microphone. That gap is what we call the third ventricle. This area where we have the middle, the thalamus, and the area around it, and the third ventricle, that collectively is called the diencephalon. The part below it we call the hypothalamus. The part above it is the epithalamus. We don't really talk about the sides, but what we can have in here is further processing of signals because right next to it is the midbrain. In this area here, we're receiving signals and we're figuring out what do we do with this information. So as we start to gather or bring in information, we can actually start to have actual feeling here. If this part here were to not properly or send information out anywhere else, so all your senses stop here, what you'd get is like if you stabbed yourself in the hand, you'd get a, that's uncomfortable. I couldn't tell you quite what it was, but I'm pretty sure I don't like it. Or you could eat a piece of chocolate and you could be like, yeah, I noticed that. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I think I like it. I think I do. You get dull senses when all we do is limit ourselves to diencephalon processing. Now obviously you can go to the cerebrum, and the cerebrum has all sorts of parts to it. So it's divided up into lobes. We have the frontal lobe, which is where a lot of your thought and consciousness turns out to be. And by consciousness I mean where you're making aware of decisions and stuff like that. We have this area that we can call the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is where any type of sound processing, either you're thinking about speaking or you're processing language or you're remembering language, turns out to be. The top is the parietal lobe. Parietal, of course, for like the parietal bones. The parietal lobe is where we deal with senses and motion. So this is where you keep your information as to how you move and how you feel things and any memory associated with movement or feelings. The hind portion of your brain, of your cerebrum, is the occipital lobe, and that's where we deal with visual processing. So interpreting what you see or remembering what you see, all of that turns out to be trapped there. Also hidden inside of all of this is one more lobe. And it's one that most people don't look at, and it's something called the insula, or the insular lobe. It's actually underneath everything else. If you look around the lateral ventricles, it's actually kind of tucked in the middle of it. What the insula turns out to deal with, as far as we can tell, is it's involved with how you take your conscious thought and how you turn it into emotion. So the insula is severely linked to something referred to as the limbic system. And the limbic system has a whole bunch of different parts to it. If you took AP Psych, I love the limbic system. So you have things like the olfactory lobes are part of it. You could have the hippocampus. You could have the amygdala. You could have things like the fornix or the hypothalamus as part of it, or the mammary body, or what have you. All of those are parts that deal with memory and emotion, because it turns out memory and emotion are severely linked to each other. Smell's in there because smell is highly linked to memory, and memory is linked to emotion. Because if you don't believe me on that one, your homework is to go out and watch a wonderful movie referred to as Inside Out. The brain is complicated. I've skipped like 99% of what we could talk about with the brain, but I'm not here to make you a neurologist. All we need to deal with are the basic pieces. If we understand the basics, we can then, if you felt like it, dive into something a little bit deeper.